Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Jeffrey Holdeman, who is a senior lecturer in Slavic and East European languages and cultures at Indiana University. His areas of research include Slavic languages, sociolinguistics, language maintenance and shift, and vampires. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much.
You have an important lecture coming up, I know, and it has something to do with vampires. I'd like you to tell us about that, and maybe we can get started there.
So I'll be doing the inaugural lecture for the grand reopening of the newly reorganized Indiana University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. So it'll be a week before Halloween, and I'll be doing a talk about the anthropological aspects of vampires.
You know, what are the anthropological aspects of vampires? Have we found relics of vampires in architectural digs somewhere?
So within vampire studies, we look at psychological and sociological functions of the various types of vampires as well. So there are a lot of the groundings within society, within sociology, within the belief systems, and the historical memory of the groups that hold vampires or that use vampires as well. So there are a lot of different angles to come into using anthropology.
So, and I understand that you sort of fit your studies into a kind of a chronology, and you believe that there are sort of different concepts of vampires for different generations. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Great. So the course that I teach, I divide into three parts, 5 weeks of Slavic and East European folklore, 5 weeks of British literature, 5 weeks of 20th and 21st century cinema, and modern subcultures as well. So we start off with the folkloric vampire from Central and Eastern Europe that is the most alien to students. They've heard the least about that. They have usually heard about the literary types of vampires, cinematic types of vampires, but don't really have any previous knowledge about the folkloric vampire, and then also
that's sort of the origin of these vampire stories, right?
Right.
Give us a little background on that, maybe.
Great. So we have to start with understanding how people were living in Central and Eastern Europe in the pre-modern era. So in the climate it's very far north, so we tend to think of Europe as being almost the same parallel as us. Central and Eastern Europe is up where Canada is. So the climate is different, the geography is different in terms of the mountains and the plains and how people are moving around and exchanging ideas through that area. The religions that were in place before and during Christianity. They're living subsistence farming in these extended families, and everyone is dependent on everyone else. There are limited resources. We talk about a concept called limited good, which is completely the opposite of what students grow up with in the United States, of unlimited bounty.
Right.
And understanding that the resources are limited and people shouldn't take more than their fair share of all of those limited resources.
And so the vampire is sort of the antithesis of that then, right? The vampire is taking what the vampire wants.
So the idea of the folkloric vampire is this reanimated corpse who comes back, and people in life who are taking more than their fair share of food, of sexual partners, of resources. In death, the only thing that they're lacking is life force, and that's where we get folkloric vampires drinking blood, because that was understood to be the source, the locus of the life force.
Right. So, and then another way that you break this down, I understand, is between folklore vampires, literary vampires, psychic vampires, psychotic vampires, which sounds interesting, and modern subculture vampires. Can we go through those a little bit?
Sure. So our first vampire is the folkloric vampire. We have to start off with that to understand.
Which is what we're talking about now,
exactly,
essentially, right?
Yeah. And as modern science, with a capital S, modern epidemiology, modern psychology, modern criminology, spreads throughout Central and Eastern Europe, where these communities had and needed this folkloric vampire to explain certain phenomena and to keep people in line sociologically. As modern sciences explained away all of those issues, aspects that were attributed to vampires, the vampire runs out of a function. It's not needed anymore. And that it could have then disappeared like so many other Slavic monsters, if you want to use that term,
right.
Beings, supernatural beings of that time. But right at that time, in the 1700s and leading into the 1800s, as modern science is explaining these things away, we get a rise in an interest after the Enlightenment period, or during the Enlightenment period, when things turn dark in Romanticism, where people are embracing the supernatural again.
Right.
Then there's we get
Goethe writes Dr. Faustus during this period, right?
We get the rise of Romantic literature, and then the vampire is prime to then go from being something which existed in the belief system of the people, the pre-modern people who held vampire beliefs, and it jumps into literature as a metaphor.
And so now we're in the second category here, right, which is the literary vampire. Now, just to give people a focus on what kind of things were going on here, I understand there was a get-together with Percy Bysshe Shelley and his wife Mary Shelley and George Gordon Lord Byron and a couple other people, and they each were challenged to write a story, right? And Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and there was another interesting story. Tell us about that.
So Lord Byron tells a vampire story, grows tired of it, doesn't really want to do anything else with it. John Polidori, who was his physician, wrote about a skull-headed lady, and they all made fun of him. And he then has lots of conflicts with the group, goes back to London, and writes a short story, turning Lord Byron into this vampire, Lord Riven.
So Lord Byron is the model for the first literary vampire, right?
So
very interesting.
We'll talk about psychic vampires and bosses who sort of drain the life out of you. So we have this wonderful pairing of a person who exhibits these vampire-like traits in real life and turns him into an actual vampire. Before this, we had vampires in Western European literature, and so his short story is called the first literary vampire in English, published in 1819. And it borrows from folklore. There's not a lot of vampire content there. People are just sort of understanding basically what a vampire is. And then over the course of the 19th century, we then get additional works that grow in length and grow in complexity, grow in their focus. So over the span of this 100 years, we get the evolution of this literary vampire.
It's an interesting evolution because we get Frankenstein and Dracula pretty much out of the same conversation, right? And then we're making movies in the early 20th century, right? And they're two of the first subjects of early movies that explore things like this, right? Yeah.
When you read Dracula, 1897, Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, he was so involved with the theater and Sir Henry Irving, the novel reads like a play. And so you can imagine people reading this novel saying, this would work really well on the stage. And the very first thing he does is has a reading of the novel on a stage, which then establishes copyright for the theater. And then we get plays that are on stage, and then early cinema picks this up and says, wow, this would be really good. And it's the technology for a vampire is relatively simple. And then we get our first vampire movies in the early 20s, and then of course, Bela Lugosi in 1931, and then it just explodes.
He owned it
after
for a while
that.
there. Yeah, it was his franchise. Yeah. Okay, and then the other categories. One of the other categories was the psychic vampire, and this is something completely different from what we're talking about here, right?
So this is why we have to talk about these 5 types, is
Yeah.
that everybody uses the word vampire, but then doesn't qualify it with what kind of vampire they're talking
Right.
about. And this is how the most common mistake that people make is this confusion between the folkloric vampire, which existed in the belief system, the people who held it, and the literary vampire, which is absolutely fiction. It's the creation of the author, and it can be whatever the author wants it to be.
Right.
It's usually based on folklore, but then it's also the inventions of the author as well, and then it can evolve. So we have this third type, the psychic vampire, and this idea, I think everybody has psychic vampires in their life. These are the general definition is that this is someone who draws psychic energy out of people. Now, we cannot show that in a laboratory, that one person would be able to draw psychic energy out of another person. But what we can see is the relationship between a person who uses the earliest psychic vampires, when we start talking about them like this in the early 1970s, is someone who uses fear, intimidation, guilt to weaken another person.
Interesting.
And so what we can show is that the psychic vampire, the person who is being vampiric, who is vampirizing a victim, is experiencing, in the act of planning, of carrying that out, of seeing the results, is gaining this chemical energy that comes from using guilt and intimidation. So we get rises in adrenaline, in endorphins, in norepinephrine, and it is chemical energy. They're not drawing it from the victim, that they're experiencing it by what they're doing. The victim on the other side, if they don't just completely, if they're not able to leave that situation, if they have to be there because it's in a family or in a work environment, the person who is experiencing that then exhibits these what seem to be wasting, this loss of energy, and this is where we'll get lowered serotonin levels, lowered dopamine levels. I'm
amazed this has been studied so closely. That's very interesting.
Cortisone levels that go up under stress, and this causes lack of appetite and withering and pallor.
Now, and this is a metaphor, essentially, but what you're describing is actually parallel to what the vampire does and what happens to the victim, isn't it?
Right. So from the outside, it looks like the psychic vampire is drawing energy because the victim is losing energy, losing weight, losing vitality, this vim and vigor. And so it looks like that's what's happening. What is actually happening is each one is having a different chemical response and long-term chemical response, and they're tied. That idea of drawing life force then parallels the folkloric vampire, which was believed to do that in that belief system, is the literary metaphor of the vampires who are literally causing chaos and withering, and then actual literary death at that time.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if maybe that isn't a pattern of behavior that goes back into very early times and maybe had something to do with the development of the myth in the first place, right?
I wouldn't say it has.
Can I call it a myth?
We won't call it that in the belief system, because that is the belief system that is held. When we look from the outside to see other people's belief systems, that's when we call what they believe superstitions.
Right.
And so we avoid that and try to stay objective about this and talk about that folkloric vampire existing in the belief system.
But then at the next level, we've got something called the psychotic vampire, right? And that's a little more interesting. This is actually a form of mental illness, right?
So the psychotic vampire is then someone who is, and that would get classified as a psychosis, someone who believes they are a folkloric vampire or a literary vampire. They are attacking people, drinking their blood, in the style of a folkloric vampire.
And there are actually cases of people doing this.
There are lots, and you'll see those about once a year, where someone who is arrested for a physical attack where they draw blood and drink their blood and say that they're a vampire. Just because someone bites someone else and consumes some of their blood doesn't
Yeah.
make them a vampire.
That would be Mike Tyson. He's not.
This is right. So this is a mental illness where they are attacking in the style of the folkloric or the literary vampire. So we in society understand that there's a relationship, that there are correlations between this, and that's why we call the psychic vampire vampire. You can imagine that those kind of poisonous relationships of power dynamics and threat and guilt have existed for millennia. When we get the term vampire that English senses, this is very vampire-like. We'll call those people psychic vampires because they're not drawing blood, they're drawing psychic energy.
Right.
And then the psychotic vampire is this idea
Takes
that
it a step further.
is saying this is a very a literal attack and drinking of blood.
Yeah. And they may not run away if you hold a cross in front of them then.
If they are in a state where they believe that will affect them, they might have a reaction that's like that. And psychic or psychotic vampire attacks are going to change over time because that depends on the media that person has been fed to where they have incorporated it in their worldview and their mindset as well. So.
And then the fifth category was the modern subculture vampire, and tell us about that.
So in the early 1980s, and basically in the middle of the 20th century, we have the growth in vampire cinema. We have the growth in vampire literature. We have Anne Rice publish Interview with the Vampire, starting the Lestat series in 1976. She does it so well. She creates that world so well. It's so compelling. It has world-building sense to it that it inspires more literature. So we get better movies after that. We get better literature after that, really tying in human condition questions with a literary vampire. In the early 1980s, we get the growth of the goth subculture. We call it goth because remember that Romanticism period from the 1790s. That then a subcategory of that is Gothic literature, but they're not vampires. So we get the merging of a lifestyle aesthetic goth plus the growth of vampire themes and vampire culture, and they merge and come into this growth in the modern vampire subculture. And these are real people. They do not believe that they are immortal. They do not believe that they are supernatural. They do not believe that they can live on human blood alone in order to sustain themselves indefinitely. It's a lifestyle, way of life. They will organize into communities, so there are cities that will have vampire houses as well. Some of these are still existing. But this idea of feeling like an outcast, feeling like you are different from other people, this gives us, again, this is our sociological function of this category. It brings people together with a common worldview.
One thing that we didn't touch on here is the sexual implications of the vampire story. And most of I'm familiar with this through literature mostly, but if you take the Frank Langella vampire, there's this heavy, emphasis that his taking the blood from these women is equivalent to them having sex. I think the way that's shot, both things happen at the same time. What's the connection there?
So we can trace these roots all the way back to the folkloric vampire.
Yeah.
And again, as I was mentioning, this idea of a person who takes more than their fair share of limited resources.
But there's a seduction element too, isn't there?
Yeah, so we have to start from the beginning and see what that idea is. That if you're living in an extended family, there are a limited number of sexual partners because you're related to all of them by blood or by marriage. And so someone who takes more than their fair share of sexual partners, we get that set up for that. We have the idea that a vampire husband can come back and impregnate his wife. Of course, it's the guy from the other village, not the vampire
Okay.
husband who's come back. But again, we can use that to our own purposes. Our folkloric vampires, you normally would not want to sleep with these people because they're a reanimated corpse. In the earliest, so our John Polidori's The Vampire, this is Lord Byron. He is still mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He's still wealthy, he's still powerful, he's still brilliant.
Yeah.
And instead of using all of those attributes, his status and everything, to do good, he preys on women. And so that sets us up, our very first literary vampire in English, and sets up that relationship. People want to invite him, Lord Riven, to their parties. Of course, he's going to go and prey on their daughters.
Right.
And then we get the evolution over the 19th century in literature of this expansion. But this is usually one vampire who becomes obsessed with a victim or more, and then pursues them.
Yeah.
And so...
This is the vampire as cad, I think, right?
Yeah, so good. So this is the merger of the demon lover theme from antiquity, and then the bad guy. So this is at the time at which we are overthrowing the nobility in Europe. Powerful people who then are preying on, using their status, their powers to prey on people.
Interesting. But I wanted to get into one other thing here. You mentioned when I was talking to you earlier that the comparison between Dracula and Santa Claus. Please tell us about that.
So Jan Perkowski, one of our foremost vampirologists, sets up a funny connection where the evolution from St. Nicholas, the gift bearer, the miracle worker, develops into Santa Claus. Dracula is evolving in the same way from this folkloric vampire, antithetically, and he's the opposite of Santa Claus. So whereas Santa Claus is associated with gift giving, selflessness, kindness, gentleness to all people, Dracula is self-centered, is selfish, takes only for his own service, is associated with darkness and not light, and with drawing life force as opposed to promoting it as well. So it's just a fun little parallel that he makes to show how the evolutions are changing over time, to make sure that we don't think of Dracula as being static. So we can see that there's an evolution.
One thing I've noticed throughout my life watching movies and reading books is it seems that we get harder and harder to scare. And I remember how terrifying Jaws was, right, when I first saw that. And a few years later, I'm watching Aliens, and we've got this, this alien creature which just, makes the shark seem like a mouse. Do you think that plays into the history of this vampire myth here? Do you think as we've gone from generation to generation, we've had to find scarier things to associate with the vampire?
Yeah, all of our art develops in that trend of that. I call it an arms escalation. The monsters are always getting more and more powerful, just like our superheroes who have to fight them become more and more powerful. And so that parallel, this is where we can look at the evolution of vampires in movies in parallel with all of our other monsters. These monsters, we can take that every age creates the vampire that it needs, and substitute in, every age creates the zombie that it needs, every age creates the ghost that it needs, and we can look at the same evolutionary developments in all of those types of monster movies. Yeah, and that's that brilliance of the every age creates the vampire that it needs. One of the things I make my students pay attention to as we're going through the folklore, as we're going through the literature and film, is at the end, is the vampire destroyed? If we have at the end of the movie, the vampire is destroyed and the sun comes up, that's hopefulness, that there is a way. It's going to be hard, some people are going to die along the way, but this can ultimately be overcome. And then we get vampire movies where the the threat is still there at the end.
Right. The vampire wins.
Either
Yeah.
the vampire hasn't been destroyed, or some new person becomes the vampire. And then we get to see this over and over in culture. So just in the 1980s, when we get drug dealers and this idea of if you kill the drug kingpin, then it'll topple everything. It's like, no, there will be a new drug kingpin that comes in. We'll get the same thing in vampire movies, where if you kill Dracula or the king vampire, somebody else is going to step into that.
Well, as I listen to you describing that, I'm thinking that maybe the scary thing for us today is to realize that the problem is systemic, right? Maybe that's where we're at consciously and subconsciously when we're looking at these things. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.